The proceeding will start.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Select Committee of the Department of Business and Trade, where I'm delighted that we've got two ministers together with Rachel Gwyon from the department. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Mr. Hans, perhaps I could start with you. Could you tell us, have you squandered the opportunity of Brexit?
No, not at all, actually. First of all, thank you, Mr. Byrne, for the opportunity, I think, to appear before you as chairman of the committee, I think, for the first time. No, I think, actually, when you look at the record of the Department of Business and Trade, securing free trade agreements with 73 countries, making sure we are the fourth largest exporter, the second largest exporter of services, I think we have done well since the foundation of the department and its predecessors.
So on the 17th of January 2017, Mrs May said that it's time for Britain to get out into the world and rediscover its role as a great global trading nation. We've now got the worst trade intensity in the G7. Has the strategy succeeded?
Well, I think, if I might, Mr. Byrne, actually the data, as I say, shows that we are the fourth largest exporter. We have a record amount of services exports, including to the European Union. And we've done probably more free trade agreements than any other country in the last 3 years.
The goal was to cover 80% of UK trade with free trade agreements. That was the manifesto commitment. We're just at about 60%. Do you think we will get to 80% coverage by the time of the election?
Well, I think, if I might, the 80% figure was predicated on a free trade agreement with the United States. That is not going to happen in the near term because the administration isn't doing free trade agreements and hasn't done free trade agreements with anybody over the last 4 years. So I think that figure, when you think about the sort of more than 30% of our trade that is with the United States, is very much predicated on the US. What we have done has been to do the trade agreement with the European Union, to do the trade agreement to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is about 15% of global GDP when the UK is in, and also to do free trade agreements with 70 other countries as well. So I think we've got an excellent record that the whole department, who have been working incredibly hard on this in recent years, can be very proud of.
Well, Mr. Manifesto commitment, was that wishful thinking, do you think, in retrospect?
Well, as I say, I think it was predicated on the actual data at the time, which remains roughly the data today, that an expectation of being able to do a free trade agreement with the United States. Unfortunately, the administration does not do free trade agreements.
Well, on the 9th of May 2016, Mr. Johnson wrote that it's absurd that Britain, historically a great free trading nation, has been unable to do a free trade deal with Australia, New Zealand, China, India and America. Now, India and New Zealand have been done. We've done 14 rounds with India. Are we going to get that deal done before the election here?
Well, look, that's obviously a live negotiation, and we are in the India sort of pre-election period at the moment, and that is something which is therefore difficult to conclude at present. India obviously has its own pre-election rules in relation to what they can and cannot do on international agreements.
That sounds like a no.
Well, I'm saying that it is a live negotiation, and we'll have to wait and see.
We've done 5 rounds with the United States. Is that deal making progress? You were there on the 12th of April.
Well, there hasn't been a further round since the change in administration in January 2021, more than 3 years ago.
It was mooted that if the US deal didn't come off, we would apply to join the USMCA. Are we going to apply to join the USMCA?
There are no plans to join the MCA, but what we are doing is a number of state-level agreements across the United States. We've secured 8 of those with individual US states, with South Carolina, North Carolina, Indiana, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, Washington State, and Utah. And we are in negotiations with 3 other states, California, Colorado, and Illinois. So I think we are in a good position in our state-level strategy with the United States.
Both Boris Johnson and Mrs May mooted the idea back in 2016 and 2017 that China would be one of the targets for a free trade agreement. Are we likely to enter into negotiations for a free trade agreement with China?
There are no plans to do a free trade agreement with China.
And if China applied to join the CPTPP, I think you've said to the House that that isn't something that we could opine on without consultation with our partners. Is that still your position?
Well, I think when it comes to new parties joining CPTPP, the UK very much signs up to what are called the Auckland Principles, which are the three principles when looking at new applicants to CPTPP. The first of those being that a prospective party must match the high standards of the agreement. It's a very, very high standards free trade agreement, CPTPP. Secondly, that they must have a track record of abiding by international trade rules. And third, they must command the consensus of the CPTPP members. Those are the Auckland Principles, which will be applied, as they were to us, to all future applicants of CPTPP as well.
We've done 6 rounds now, I think, with the GCC. Is that deal going to get done before the election?
Well, that's also a live negotiation that Secretary of State and I are engaged with on a regular basis. We met the GCC trade ministers just before Ramadan at Abu Dhabi in the sidelines of the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference. Talks are ongoing, and we hope to secure what I think will be a very good free trade agreement for the United Kingdom. We do a lot of trade with the Gulf. It's one of the regions where the UK really punches above its weight. A lot of investment comes in from the Gulf, of course, as well. So we're looking forward to doing a really good agreement with them.
So will that be done before our election, do you think?
Well, again, it's a live negotiation. We'll have to just have a bit more patience, I think, Mr. Byrne.
Okay, so we won't hit the 80% target, and the US deal won't happen. The China deal is not started. USMCA is off the table. And GCC we're going to wait and see, and India we're going to wait and see. That's the summary.
Well, I would add to that, if I might, Mr. Byrne, the fact this country has actually concluded more free trade agreements with more counterparts more quickly than potentially any other.
But they were rollovers, I think. Let's go to Julian Marsden on the United States.
There's 73 countries in that. That is a very significant achievement.
They're mainly cut and paste. Go on, Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on the US side again, just trying to get a bit more background on what's happening behind the scenes, if anything. You quite rightly said that the US has not entered into negotiations. When Ambassador Tai was asked in a Senate committee recently about an easy trade agreement with the UK, she said there are no easy FTAs, but she also referenced the UK-Canada negotiations stopping, and she said because the UK won't talk agriculture market access. What were you told when you were in Washington recently? Is it a blanket no, or is there more going behind the scenes and messages that the US are picking up from what the UK is doing elsewhere?
Well, thank you, Ms. Marsden. And I was actually in the United States the week before Ambassador Tai's appearance before the Senate. What I would say is that agriculture has been very much part of the talks with Canada. And also agriculture featured as part of the talks in the US-UK FTA negotiations back in 2020. With Canada, of course, the reason for the talks not progressing were 2 or 3 reasons. First, that the failure to roll over the rules of origin on electric vehicles and rules of origin more broadly. Secondly, the Canadian ask, if you like, for us to change our SPS rules where it came to beef in particular. Those are the reasons that we put a pause on the talks with Canada. But as you can see, very much agriculture was part of those discussions.
So has that had an implication for the US, or are there any discussions happening behind the scenes with the US on potentially reopening negotiations on an FTA?
Well, look, I think the US has been clear they don't want to do free trade agreements at the moment, but that doesn't prevent us from having a very active trade policy with the United States. If you look at the achievements we've had with the present administration, notwithstanding the fact they don't want to do an FTA, but what we have done is we've had the Section 232 tariffs removed, the Section 301 tariffs. We've engaged in very heavily We are talking with the administration about a critical minerals agreement, and there are other things going on, notwithstanding the fact that a free trade agreement isn't going to happen.
Lord Frost was here a week or so ago. He was of the opinion that a trade deal was more likely if Donald Trump was elected. Do you share that view?
Well, I think we're just, again, going to have to wait and see. My sort of experience as a UK government minister is rarely productive to speculate on the outcomes of foreign elections, particularly those elections in the United States. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see whatever new administration forms next January, what their approach might be. But I would just stress again that we do have some significant achievements in our trade relationship with the United States under both the last administrations, and the UK always stands ready to improve that relationship still further. The US is our single largest bilateral trade partner, and we're always looking to improve the terms of trade that we have with the United States.
Thank you. And could you just clarify for the committee, there's been a bit of a difference in communication on Canada. We've said the discussions are continuing. Canada have said they're not. What's your view on your perspective on what's actually happening there?
Well, thank you. I mean, the discussions have been paused. The Secretary of State and I both met Mary Ng, the Canadian Trade Minister, in Abu Dhabi at the end 2 months ago, at the end of February. We stand ready to restart those talks, but we do need to see a shift on rules of origin and on cheese quotas.
So they're the actual barriers at the moment. They're the two areas that are preventing.
And also the Canadian demand for us to change, or the Canadian request, if you like, the imploration for us to change SPS rules, which has been absolutely clear. The Prime Minister's letter to farmers for the last year, absolutely clear that we would not be changing our SPS rules when it came to beef. So that is also an important consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify, the Secretary of State has said that the talks have not broken down, but you've said that they're paused. What is the difference between a breakdown and a pause?
Well, I don't think, Mr. Byrne, there need necessarily be a difference between a breakdown and a pause. We stand ready to restart those talks on the assumption that Canada, is serious. I might add, in terms of rules of origin, the EU...
Sorry, there isn't a difference.
Well, it need not necessarily be different. I'm saying they're not polar opposites, but I think it's worth bearing in mind, Mr. Byrne, if I might, that Canada has been the only one of our trade partners that has not rolled over those rules of origin.
No, but I'm just trying to square this circle, because the Secretary of State has told the House that the Canadian talks have not broken down, but you've just told the committee that they have been paused, and I'm trying to understand the difference between a pause and a breakdown.
Well, something can be paused
both imply,
without it meaning
both imply that they have stopped.
No, I think something has been paused. That does not necessarily mean that it is broken down. We, as I've said, we stand ready to re-engage with Canada, but looking at those three things in particular. We need Canada to restore the former rules of origins arrangements and to resolve a commitment to resolve the UK's lost dairy access. If I might, our other trade partners have rolled over those.
No, I understand
South Korea, Mexico,
the content of the talks,
the EU itself.
I'm just trying to understand what, in your language, then, what is the definition of a breakdown and what is the definition of a pause?
Well, if I might, Mr. Byrne, I'm not here to provide you with a definitional arrangement.
We're trying to reconcile the comments from your Secretary of State and your comments, and at the moment we're struggling to reconcile them.
Well, I think they're perfectly reconcilable, and as I've explained, we stand ready to restart those talks if movement is made on rules of origin and on dairy quotas. That is where we stand. We've explained that clearly to our Canadian counterparts when we last met with Mary Ng, and I think that is well understood.
Well, that's as clear as mud. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, given that talks have either paused or broken down, they've stopped, and that there's no agreement being pursued with the US, India's yet to be done and so on, what's your view as to whether the better focus would be on trusted trade rather than free trade, and perhaps you might want to say a little bit about that, because we've already got significant institutions that we're party to, the five power defence arrangements, AUKUS, the Tempest programme, the EU, NATO and the Commonwealth. Should we be shifting our diplomatic efforts into a trusted trade relationship and developing that using those sorts of bodies? Is that something that would attract? If we've stalled and paused free trade agreements, is trusted trade something that you could pursue?
Could I just seek through you, Chair, just a bit more of a definition as to what you mean by trusted trade?
Well, if free trade agreements are proving hard to sign, which is what we take from your first answers, actually, should we be shifting towards a strategy based on trade diplomacy? Would that yield more with our trusted partners, for example, our defence allies?
Well, I'd say two things to that. First is we're incredibly active on trade diplomacy. I used the example of the United States as to the action that we've taken on, for example, removing those tariffs, the Section 232 tariffs and others, which were really quite damaging to parts of our steel industry. So we do actively use trade diplomacy. But I'd also contest with you, Mr. Byrne, any idea that we haven't been successful on doing free trade agreements. We have done trade agreements, free trade agreements with 73 countries, plus the European Union, plus joining CPTPP, which is a major achievement to be the first country to join CPTPP. And we have covered, in the time available, the last 3 years since we've had an effective operating independent trade policy, a very, very successful program of free trade agreements.
Well, what's your sense? So the commitment to free trade agreements and the pursuit thereof that's undiminished. But what's the picture in the rest of the world? Is everybody else sort of wedded to this notion of expanding exports and trade by this mechanism, or are they also exploring diplomatic routes that you've described?
I think, if I might, Mr. MacDonald, you have to follow multiple tracks, and we always have to operate. These are all negotiations, and they're all bilateral or sometimes plurilateral arrangements, for example, with CPTPP, and we always have to operate in the area of, as Geoffrey Boycott used to call it, the corridor of uncertainty as to where our counterpart will want to do. Will they want to do a free trade agreement? The United States at the moment is not negotiating free trade agreements, but we can still do a lot with the United States. We have done a number of agreements. We've done 2 bilateral agreements with Singapore, for example. That is a counterpart that does want to do free trade agreements and similar kind of agreements. We've done a digital economy agreement with Ukraine. We have done a lot of trade agreements over the last 3 years, but that doesn't prevent us from also engaging diplomatically, whether it be bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally at the WTO. The UK, our overall approach is to be a very strong and active voice for free trade, doing agreements in the national UK interest. And that is, I think, what we've been delivering on, really, particularly in the last 3 years since the independent trade policy has been effective.
Can I move on, Chair, just to explore another area? Because we had the Resolution Foundation before us in our last session, and they raised their idea of pursuing services only trade agreements rather than FTAs, so that we play to our exporting strengths. What consideration have you given to that approach of service only agreements?
Well, I think, Mr. MacDonald, of course, under the WTO definitions, a free trade agreement must cover the majority of trade. Yeah, so a free trade agreement will typically need to include goods as well. But we are very focused on making sure that services are included in our agreements. For example, these digital economy agreements. For example, the negotiations on upgraded FTAs. Let me take, for example, the one we recently launched with Turkey. The existing UK-Turkey deal, which is a rolled-over EU deal, doesn't include services at all. Yet we do a huge amount of services exports to Turkey, and making sure that upgraded arrangement would enable us to sell more services into Turkey. It is really very, very good for our services industries, whether they be financial services, professional business services, legal services, all of these things that the UK excels at. So we follow very much pushing to get our services export. A big part of our Switzerland negotiations at the moment is making sure that services are right at the heart of that agreement.
So it has to be wedded to goods in your view?
No, I'm saying a free trade agreement, by definition, because it has to cover the majority of trade, will typically have to include goods. I'm not saying we're wedded to that. I'm saying we're very actively involved on services.
So do you reject the notion that there's an opportunity to expand and export more if there were singular focuses on service agreements between nation states for us to export those services? Are you saying that's not on your radar, that's not on your agenda to pursue services-only agreements?
Well, we will do, Mr. MacDonald, what we can and do to maximise our services possibilities with the UK. We are the world's second largest services exporter. We've had really big success across the board in exporting more services, particularly over the last 3 years. That is a big part of our trade agreement agenda, but it does not need to be at the exclusion of goods. What you want to be doing is a deals on both together, or the digital economy agreements will typically be services focused. So it will depend on which counterpart.
I'm just puzzled by that, because if the free trade agreement is being paused, or it's been however you want to describe it, but there are other opportunities on services that you could pursue without those challenges or difficulties in those negotiations. Why would you not do that?
Do you mean specifically with Canada?
With any country. I mean, I'm talking about where you've got paused or terminated agreements, negotiations right now. Why would you not be open to the possibility of service-only agreements in those circumstances?
To be absolutely clear, Mr. MacDonald, the only counterpart with whom we currently have a pause negotiation is Canada. Yeah. So if your question is more broadly, I refer you to my earlier answer that services is very, very much part of our negotiation strategy. For example, I cited the negotiations we're doing at the moment with Switzerland, with Turkey, or upgraded free trade agreements based on previous free trade agreements that were rolled over from the EU that did not typically include services.
Okay.
So I'm going to bring in Anthony in a second, but the philosophical question I guess we're getting to here is that at the time of Brexit, the IMF estimated that there were about 500 trade restrictions introduced by countries around the world. We're now at 2,500. So as countries begin de-risking supply chains, introducing national security requirements, trade barriers, in particular non-tariff barriers, are multiplying very, very quickly. We've gone through the fact that we'll probably miss the 80% free trade target. You're not, understandable reasons, incredibly clear about what deals will get done before the election. But your department, in June 23, said that it's spending £44.1 million on negotiating trade agreements. And in the supplementary estimates, it says that there's 118 million being spent on trade policy implementation and negotiations. And so the question the committee's got to ask is, given how hard it is to negotiate free trade agreements in today's world, would the department's resource be better invested in driving through on trade diplomacy, like the Atlantic Charter, given that you may be banging your head against a brick wall in trying to get any more free trade agreements done?
Well, thank you for agreeing that the 80% target was not reached for understandable reasons. What I might say, though, is, Mr. Byrne, is that we are pursuing all of these things. We have an incredibly active trade diplomacy. We have incredibly active work on removing market access barriers. I, Lord Offord, the whole ministerial team, the Secretary of State are engaged on a very, very regular basis, whether it's removing a Taiwan bottle code through to a Peruvian metals test.
You've only got so much resource in the department, and the question is, where is the bang for the buck? So we've taken evidence, for example, from the UK-US Chamber of Commerce that says many of the opportunities that were set out in the Atlantic Charter, for example, aren't being pursued fast enough. If you've only got a certain amount of resource, where do you get the biggest yield? Do you get the biggest yield through driving harder with trade diplomacy, or do you get the biggest yield taking, in your language, multiple tracks, which is, from the sound of it, trying to do everything?
No, I think we're not trying to do everything, Mr. Byrne. If we were trying to do everything, we would be literally in FTA negotiations, with every counterpart around the world, which we clearly are not. So we have an approach which will look at those FTAs. We, as you rightly said, we are currently in negotiation, very live negotiation with India, with the GCC. We are ratifying CPTPP, making sure our counterparts ratify CPTPP. We're in next generation FTA negotiations with 6 counterparts at the moment. But on top of that, we do an enormous amount in reducing market access barriers, making sure that tariffs are removed. I mentioned the Section 232 activity with the US a couple of years ago. So we're very, very active across a wide range of fronts. But I don't think it requires a decision to not pursue FTAs. I mean, clearly FTAs are still being done around the world. And the UK is very much part of that. We've done FTAs with 73 countries.
I don't expect you to have these figures with you, but I'd be grateful if you could write to us with a breakdown. Of the 118 million that was set out in the supplementary estimate, it would be really useful for the committee if your officials could disaggregate that amount into how much is being spent on FTA negotiation and how much of that is being spent on trade diplomacy. Would that be something you can provide us?
Well, look, I can pledge to provide as much information as I can, but it may not be 100% straightforward to disaggregate an individual who is involved perhaps from post in an FTA negotiation, but most of the time is actually spent on market access barriers.
Thank you. Anthony Magnan.
Just very briefly, and following on from Mr. McDonald's questions, why aren't we sort of looking at more of a sector-by-sector approach? I just want to push you on this because we've clearly done it to great success with the Singapore Digital Partnership, where we have focused on one specific area. If there is a big appetite within the department to get up that percentage, why aren't we going out there and saying, actually, here with America we could do something on financial services, here we could do something with India on education? Why aren't we sort of being a little bit more proactive in that approach?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Magnan. Well, we do that. For example, the Berne Agreement on Financial Services Trade with Switzerland was a perfect example of a sectoral deal with a like-minded country, that we did that deal notwithstanding the fact that we're in FTA negotiations with Switzerland at the same time. So nothing obviates, nothing being in an FTA negotiation doesn't obviate us from doing a deal pragmatically in a different sector.
About you.
Or still yours.
Is it? I don't think it is.
In which case, let me come to Mr. Paulson.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Minister, I want to ask about how we measure success in our trade environment. If you're in business, you set a budget, you set an objective, it might be a target, you run the business for a period of time and you measure your success against that target. When it comes to trade, we know that, and you've told us about 73 trade deals we've done, but the trade deals in themselves do nothing. All they do, frankly, is open a door, and it's then down for individual businesses, and particularly the sales function within those businesses, to take advantage of those particular deals. How should we go about measuring that? And this question arises from the Secretary of State appearing before us in January 2024, when it appeared that one of the measures of performance of accession to CPTPP would be an increase to GDP, when it was suggested by her officials that accession would boost GDP by 0.09%. Is that a good measure of performance of a trade deal?
Well, look, I mean, you're right in the sense that signing a piece of paper in itself, signing these free trade agreements, I'm sure you've seen, can typically be more than 1,000 pages. And I always say there's no point doing one of these negotiations unless it works for our businesses, unless it works for our exporters and Minister Offord's side of the department, unless it works for our consumers as well. So that is very much at the forefront. You know, in the world of the slightly esoteric world of trade policy, you can easily become sort of immersed in detail and losing the big picture as to what works for British companies, British consumers, British exporters. But one thing I would say is, you know, the proof is, if you like, in the pudding, that we have advanced, just overtaken Japan, thanks to the work from Lord Offord and his officials, to be the world's fourth largest exporter. I think that is
it the value of exports that we should be looking at?
Well, I think.
What are the criteria? What are the measures of performance? How are we going to be able to say yes? In this area, we've taken these Brexit freedoms and we've succeeded.
Well, it's sometimes difficult, if I might, Mr. Pawsey, to be very specific, to have a specific target in a specific area. For example, CPTPP. You rightly mentioned that the analysis was that the increase to GDP would not be as significant as we'd want it to be, but that fails to take into consideration the ability of CPTPP to grow.
Is increase to GDP a good measure of performance of our export strategy?
Well, I think it would depend. I mean, we can bring in Lord Offord in a moment in terms of the export strategy, but just on CPTPP, of course, one of the biggest things about CPTPP is its ability to grow in the future. So there's 11 original counterparties. We're the 12th.
Sure. So should we have a number that we should be anticipating or expecting or setting as an objective as a consequence of having done that deal? That's the bit I want to pin down on, because it's all very well doing all these deals and joining in all these partnerships if it actually doesn't result in more business and a boost to our economy.
Well, I think we are seeing that boost to our economy. We are seeing that boost to our exports. Sometimes, though, when you set out to negotiate a free trade agreement, it's hard to estimate precisely what the impact on GDP will be, because you don't yet know what is going to be in the agreement. If you don't actually have, at the start of the negotiation, any knowledge of what the end of the negotiation is going to look like, it's quite hard to estimate what the impact of GDP will be.
You won't start a negotiation without having some expectation of what the end game would be.
But you can. It's hard to be precise because ultimately it's a negotiation, and your negotiation. We may say we wish to reduce whiskey tariffs to that particular country, but if that country does not want to reduce whiskey tariffs, then the change in GDP will not ultimately be what is realised in the negotiation. So my point is that when you set out a GDP objective, it's not always what will be realised, because it depends what is actually negotiated.
Maybe we'd be better off looking at value of exports. Lord Offord.
Yes, thank you. I can come in on that. I think we have got a very good target, which is called $1 trillion of exports, right? Oh. So we're currently sitting at 860.
Yes.
Right? And we're going to get to $1 trillion. And we've got a target of getting there by 2030, which I think we'll probably smash that. We need it's 2% per annum growth between
very positive and very bullish.
Yeah, well, it's 2% growth between now and 2030 to get to $1 trillion. In the 10 years up to 2019, we grew at 5%. Our exports grew at 5%. So that 2% is just on a straight line. That's without any government intervention, which is what we're doing through these FTAs. What's interesting is we've got 2.5 million registered companies in the UK, of whom 300,000 export. To my mind, that's a low number. So 11%.
We can all agree on that.
Right. So one target might be, let's get it up to 500,000. Let's get it up to 20%. Let's be in the top 20%. But are
you giving us targets there?
I think we can talk about that. I think the department's talking about this idea of actual real numbers. And why is that important? Because when we look at the companies that export, we discover that they share certain characteristics. Number one, they're ambitious management teams, quite often owner-managed. Number two, they're selling their goods and services around the world, which means they're world-class. Quite often they can get higher margins by selling overseas than they can knocking their heads against the grocers, for example, in the domestic market. Here's the thing, they're more profitable, and the silver bullet is they pay higher wages, right? If 70% of those exporters are based out of London and the South East, we've got a levelling up agenda, which is real, which basically is about prosperity. It's about people in local areas and local businesses in Scotland and Ireland, outside London South East, making better money, getting better trained, and being in better paid jobs. And that's what I think is the crucial link to our growth, our prosperity.
I think we can all buy into that. I think what we're trying to batten the Minister down on is how we set that as an objective and a measure of performance, so that at the end of a period we can say we set out to do that and we delivered it. And $1 trillion, if we get there, that's the objective.
That's a great target.
Okay.
But the other target would be to increase the number of companies exporting, I think.
Right. So could you just re-summarise for us? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we were writing a public service agreement between the Treasury and your department, or let's say that the Prime Minister was hauling you in for a stock take. What are the metrics that you would use, or would you want to use to demonstrate success? Is it add to GDP, as Mr. Pawsey says? Is it volume? Is it value? Should you be dealing in real terms rather than inflation-tested numbers? What are the key metrics?
All the numbers I would give you now are all inflation adjusted, because we've been through such a period of to make it real, right?
Yeah.
I would say, look, our economy, the UK is an 80% service economy, 20% goods, right? 80% of people work in service companies, 80% of our GBA is in services, right? But our exports actually are 55%, 45%. So our goods are 45% of our exports. What does that tell you? Our goods are very good, and they go around the world, right? There's a premium for British goods. Wherever I go, there's a premium for British goods. So our manufacturing is in very good health.
I'm trying to cut through the narrative to the numbers.
Then you've got the
metrics.
Then you've got the 55% services. The direction of travel is we're going to have 2/3 services, 1/3 goods, and these are high margin jobs. So the metrics I would be giving are the trillion is a key metric that we can demonstrate that we've hit that number. Increase the number of companies that are exporting. Demonstrate that we can link that to the FTAs that we're signing, so I can give real live examples that since we've signed the Australia trade deal, we've got SMEs selling to Australia that weren't before we signed that deal. So that's another real metric where it's proving that that trade deal has resulted in increased trade. And then when you look at then what the number of people employed in exporting companies and the fact that they're getting higher wages, I've got a whole matrix of data points that I can give you that say that. What does that result in? Increased prosperity.
When you say increased prosperity, are you saying that that is a GDP statistic or not?
I mean pound in the pocket. I mean how people live. I mean how people get paid and how they.
His question was, should we be looking at the impact of these trade deals on GDP growth?
Well, the economists will always want to do that. Right? That's what economists do.
So will this committee. Because
but I think the man in the street wants to know how they're getting paid and what their standard of living is. And I think they want to work in companies that are prosperous and growing ambitious companies. And the export strategy is absolutely key to that. And signing these FTAs is absolutely key to that.
Okay, let me try a different track. Rachel, how does the Permanent Secretary hold you to account for delivery on free trade agreements?
I'm the Director for UK Export Strategy, and I support Minister Offord in getting the right mix of export promotion services to support his goals. And we look at the statistics, we look at the trends, both internationally and by sector and by market, and we look at the evidence of what works in the UK services.
Are you making judgments about resource prioritisation based on the impact on GDP growth?
We're making judgments about the service optimisation and the best targeting to help companies right across all parts of the UK, whether SMEs or larger companies, to support ministers to reach their race to $1 trillion ambition.
Are you looking at any stage at statistics based on GDP growth?
We are a department for economic growth, and we are looking at all aspects of that, as the Minister says, whether that's wages growth, whether it's the increase in survivability of companies, whether it is the increase in their turnover and their export value. We're looking at that in evaluation. We published evaluation last year showing the impact of our services in helping companies do exactly that.
Are you evaluating the impact of what you do on GDP growth?
GDP is growing as a result of trade.
No, but are you at any stage in your work evaluating the impact of what you do on GDP growth?
If I might, Mr. Byrne, I don't think that's, strictly speaking, in Ms. Gwyon's area. Her job is to do the
Then let me put the
exports.
question to you, Minister.
Well, indeed. I would say, of course, we want to see GDP rise, and trade agreements and making sure we've got good export promotion is a good way to make GDP rise. But do we have a specific target in relation to free trade agreements and trade policy to make GDP rise? No, we do not have that specific target.
The reason it's important is because many of the impact assessments that go with the free trade agreement express an impact on GDP growth.
Yeah, but the
Secretary of State has resiled from some of those figures for understandable reasons. We're just trying to understand, as a department, do you use that way of evaluating your work?
If I might, Mr. Byrne, and I return to the earlier point I made, that at the start of a negotiation, it's impossible to know what is actually going to be in the free trade agreement at the end of the day. That is why it is very difficult, if you like, to aggregate all of those FTA objectives when you lay out these different things, and say that will be the total impact on GDP, because it would depend on the result of the negotiation.
So if you've got £118 million worth of resource, which is what the supplementary estimates say, and you've got a number of trade agreements under negotiation, USA, India, Gulf Cooperation Council, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Switzerland, South Korea, Maldives and Turkey, how do you take a judgment about where to invest your resource for the best outcome for the UK?
Well, I think that would be, if you like, you and I have both been Chief Secretaries of the Treasury before, and that's, of course, one of the key roles in government is looking at how to allocate your resources. And sometimes you might do that in a more thematic way rather than a more precise way. I would say, when you look at, say, somebody like the head of trade policy at our embassy in Washington, who was very heavily engaged in free trade agreements a few years ago, is now very heavily engaged in market access, supporting work on the state-level MOUs. It's quite difficult, if you like, to disaggregate individual officials, individual efforts within the department as to whether that person should be on trade policy agreements or should be on removing trade barriers and other trade diplomacy.
But how do you prioritise the use of your department's resource then?
Well, we can move people around, and we do. I mean, many of our trade negotiators have moved from negotiating previous deals to the present deals. Obviously, we don't have an Australia FTA trade negotiation team anymore because we've done that deal. So people will be moved from Australia, from New Zealand, from CPTPP to other negotiations we're doing, whether they be with Switzerland, whether they be with India, whether they be with the Gulf and so on.
But I mean, how do you take a decision, for example, the Maldives deal no doubt is important, but I mean, how do you take a decision not to put all £118 million worth of resource into getting a deal done with the Maldives? How do you decide how to spread your resource across the panoply of trade deals that you've got underway?
Well, I think that, if I might, and going back to when you and I used to each do this, Mr. Byrne, overseeing how government departments spent their money, you have to rely on the quality of the officials working for you to be able to make sensible decisions in terms of localised resource allocation. I don't think it's really my job as the Minister for Trade Policy to sort of be moving people around between individual negotiations. It's our job to set the overall parameters of the department, the objectives of the department, and then the job of our officials to meet those expectations. So if there is a need to move somebody because we're starting a new negotiation, then I would expect the teams to be able to find people from previous negotiations to be able to move in to do those new ones, as an example.
When the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is marking your report card at the end of term, they're not judging you on whether you've contributed to GDP growth. They're looking at the sorts of numbers that Lord Offord shared with us. Is that true?
I think, as you know, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor will have a regular series of letters and in terms of where the Cabinet level for determining what should be the objectives of the department. So the Prime Minister meets with the Secretary of State on a regular basis to review the objectives that the Prime Minister has indicated for the department. But again, the Prime Minister would not be sort of setting like allocation targets of the number of people to be involved in FTA negotiations vis-à-vis export promotion or removing market access barriers. That is not an effective way of good governance.
Anthony.
One thing we can measure is the way in which you spend your resources. Is your department well allocated? Do you feel you have the right amount of resources from the Treasury to do the job that you need to do?
Well, I speaking from my own area, I can ask Lord Offord to answer on behalf of exports, but I think for my own area on trade policy, it clearly needs careful management. We've got some excellent directors, deputy directors who do that, and it needs the ability to move people around. Some people are easier to move around, particularly London-based people are easier to move around. And over the years, I've seen people who started out doing something like the US FTA negotiation and are now in a very, very different role. It's harder, obviously, at post to move people around with that same degree of swiftness.
Would you say your department's built up a capacity and an expertise in terms of trade negotiations? And where are you from 2016 to 2024? How large has the growth been in terms of that expertise, which is UK citizens working on trade negotiations? What's it gone from?
Well, I think, if I might, Mr. Magnan, and you actually sort of hit the nail on the head, really, that the UK, back in 2016, at the foundation of the Department for International Trade, I mean, it was me, the member for North Somerset, the member for Wyre Forest, and probably about 10 officials camped out in a corner of 1 Victoria Street, the previous BIS building, who had to sort of build the department from scratch. But obviously we had resources. Commercial diplomacy networks around the world were moved into DIT, existing staff. We brought in sector teams from BIS, the rest of government, but we built that up. We hired people from outside. We brought in Crawford Faulkner as, if you like, the key advisor on how to do trade agreements. And we built up a really good, strong department when it comes to trade policy, which, having been involved from the very beginning, and this is my, as you know, my 4th stint at the department, I've seen that side of the department really grow and be, I think, one of the world's best and most capable sets of trade policy officials that, I'm immensely proud of. When I take my officials to the World Trade Organization conference in Abu Dhabi and I see our officials matching up with our counterparts, I think we've done an amazing job in this country of building a capability that was principally a Brussels competence prior to 2021.
You mentioned these external hires. Is Crawford Faulkner good value for money?
I think he is. He's been immensely valuable advising on trade negotiations, advising on our approaches, advising on those key trade-offs as you get towards the end of a negotiation. I think he's been an immense official for the department and has really delivered for us.
So you will know as well as I do, and I expect you were in the chamber for it. I was certainly sitting in there when George Eustace decided to tell the House that Crawford Faulkner had always internalised Australian demands. He resented people who had a greater understanding of the technical issues than he did, and that he was surprised to turn up to the UK and find that there were several hundred civil servants who knew more about trade than he did. I mean, is that an accurate assessment? Is the Secretary of State right or wrong? Is the former Secretary of State for Agriculture right or wrong in this? And if he is wrong, why is he so aggrieved about a trade deal that he views as particularly detrimental to British farmers?
Well, some of those questions might be better put not to me, if I might, Mr. Mangel. What I can say is that Crawford Faulkner, and I speak to him incredibly regularly, I think has really, really delivered for this department and delivered for the country. And I don't think that we would be in the position that we are today with free trade agreements with 73 countries, being the first country to accede to the CPTPP, and having done other crucial, really important agreements like the digital economy agreements with Ukraine, with Singapore, had it not been for Crawford Faulkner's input.
And in terms of just the view on the Australia trade agreement, that is a deal that has come under an enormous amount of scrutiny and an enormous amount of criticism from different parts of this country. I just wonder whether or not, given Crawford Faulkner's role in this, you have any sort of view or perspective as to whether or not he did a good or bad job.
Well, I'm certain, Mr. Magnan, the Australia Free Trade Agreement will be an excellent deal, is an excellent deal for this country. That doesn't stop it being a good deal for Australia at the same time. Trade is not a zero-sum game. The trade agreement only entered into force in May of last year, so we've literally had 1 year of its operation. As Lord Offord said, some of the early signs are that UK SMEs are exporting to Australia that weren't previously exporting. Obviously, the removal of things like whisky tariffs and a whole host of other tariffs, I think, has opened up huge opportunities for UK exporters into Australia, as well as the similar agreement with New Zealand.
And just final bit from me, is that a model that you're going to continue, whereby we hire ex-diplomats from other countries to come in and work in the Department of International Trade? Or the Department of Business and Trade?
I think it was very much I'm not excluding, and Secretary of State I'm sure wouldn't exclude doing that in the future, but I think it was very much a response to, at the time, that the UK, this was a competence that the UK last had in, I think, 1973, was not something that we were going to find in great measure domestically here in the UK. I think it was a response to the circumstances of the UK having its trade policy, independent trade policy, for the first time in 40 years. And I think Crawford Falcon has really helped, as well as all of the officials who we've also hired from outside within the UK, but also the officials who came from UKTI, who came from BIS, who came from the FCDO, from DFID. A lot of people have come together to make the trade side of this department as powerful as it is.
Okay. Thank you.
So he's worth every penny of the £275,000 that he's currently paid on.
I really think he has, Mr. Byrne. I think I would recommend that the committee, I think you have had, certainly in the past, Crawford Falconer has appeared before the committee.
Well, we've certainly tried.
He has, I believe I think I saw a nod from Mr. Magnell that he has appeared before the committee.
Sorry, just to clarify, under the Trade Committee rather than the Business and Trade Committee.
Yeah.
So
he has appeared before your predecessor committee, and I think he has provided an immense amount of work for this country. And if I could pay tribute to him, I think he's been a really, really important person for the United Kingdom overall in the last few years.
Thank you. Mr. MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Lord Offord gave us the indication what all this is about. Trade policy is in pursuit of better living standards and people having more money in their pockets. And we can all have our view about how that's working out right now. But trying to get a measure on this and how your decisions are informed, Minister, can I revisit the issue of regulatory independence and dynamic alignment, how that feeds through at the end of this? Because obviously we've got three EFTA countries who have their own independent trade policy, but they're dynamically aligned. You've rejected that. I think you told the House the UK proposed an equivalence agreement on the sanitary and Pfizer sanitary rules and negotiations. That was proposed by Lord Frost, but the EU refused. The EU does have agreements with, for example, New Zealand and others that still respect regulatory autonomy. We are very happy to discuss with Brussels an agreement on SPS rules so long as it respects UK regulatory autonomy, and we do not sign up to dynamic regulatory autonomy. That is the read across to other trade agreements. It allows us to have an independent trade policy while maintaining the high quality trade deal that we have with the European Union. So I just want to get a handle on what the numbers are telling you. We've had some numbers discussed this morning, but if you get to a situation where the gains that we're making in FTAs and they don't outweigh the loss of goods trade with the EU, would you reconsider aligning with EU standards if that's what the numbers are going to tell you?
Well, I think it would be a mistake, Mr. MacDonald, if I might, to do that. And I stand by those words that you quoted back for me. I think it would be a mistake for this country to go into a dynamic regulatory alignment relationship with the European Union. Whilst it may work for a smaller market, particularly some of the EFTA countries, I don't think it would work for the United Kingdom. And if I might, I think you might be one of the first members of Parliament to start complaining if we were to have a dynamic regulatory alignment with the EU. Because I suspect you may not like some of those regulations coming out from Brussels in the future years. So I stand by those comments. It would not be in the UK national interest to have dynamic regulatory alignment with the EU where we had no say over those rules. And I think you would start to question the democratic deficit that we would have. Previously, when we were in the European Union, obviously there was a seat at that table. In fact, that seat was occupied by me at the EU Trade Foreign Affairs Council. But we would not have a seat at the table when those rules were being made. Yet we would have to apply those rules. And I think you, if I might be one of those members of Parliament who would ask ministers like me, why have we suddenly signed up to this new thing? And I would say, well, I'm afraid to say, Mr. MacDonald, we didn't have any choice because you suggested that we have dynamic regulatory alignment. So I'm kind of suggesting to you it might not be in the interest of this country.
What I might think, in the future. I'm asking what you think when you're looking at the numbers, and that's what I'm asking you. if the losses with our trade with the European Union aren't we're not any better off, then don't you revisit the issue? Or are you saying in no circumstances, if the losses with the EU trade exceed the gains we've had with FTAs, that's it. That's the job done. We're finished.
Well,
we'll suffer that.
I might dispute, if I might, through you, Chair, what you're saying are the numbers, because when it comes to services, we have record services exports into the European Union. We are overall just become, as Lord Offord confirmed, the world's fourth largest exporter. So I think actually the numbers can show a high degree of success of our overall trade policy.
The question, Minister, was about dynamic alignment on SPS. So the free trade deals, the new free trade deals that have been signed together add about 800 million a year to trade. There have been estimates last week that show that there could be a £3 billion impact on consumers because of the new border arrangements that are in place, because we don't have dynamic alignment. So I think Mr McDonald's question is really quite focused on the virtues or the problems associated with dynamic alignment on SPS or indeed goods.
Well, I think again, it would not be in the UK's interest to have dynamic alignment with the European Union, where essentially the UK would have those, where the UK would not have a say on those rules. I think that would be really problematic. There's something more like 20,000 tariff lines. If you're asking me to commit to all 20,000 tariff lines, I'm just saying, in principle, dynamic alignment is not in the UK national interest, I believe.
On anything.
It is possible, however, to do something where you recognise the equivalence of outcome. I mean, if I could look, for example, I know that I think Mr McDonald's sort of driving towards a veterinary agreement with the European Union. And I think you have to look at what kinds of veterinary agreements there are out there. The EU veterinary agreement with New Zealand, for example, tends to recognise an equivalence of outcome. That would be much more interesting for this country than a EFTA-style dynamic alignment. So making sure your regulations are always the same as whatever Brussels has dictated.
Nichols.
Thank you, Chair. The government's critical imports and supply chain strategy says that DBT will, quote, ensure our international trade agreements help to strengthen supply chain resilience. We're currently experiencing chronic shortages of key medicines, and the Food and Drink Federation and Horticulture Trade Association have given stark warnings about supply chain resilience following changes to the border operating model, with criticism of DBT's communication of information. What is more critical than food and medicine, Minister?
I might hand over to Lord Offord in a moment to talk about the border target operating model, which I think was part of your question. But if I were to look at, broadly speaking, the trade policy that the approach when it comes to trade policy is to maximise the number of our counterparts. And part of that, as has been outlined in the strategy published in January, has been to make sure that we can source things like critical minerals, that we can source things like food, that we can source things like pharmaceuticals from different parts of the world. And that is a key objective. And that is one of the things that we're delivering on. Australia, the Australia trade deal, the CPTPP deal, enables us to source things from different parts of the world, which I think for a country like the UK is very, very good news for the UK, where we're not going to be able to produce everything ourselves. So being able to source things from multiple different parts of the world, and one of the reasons why we've done the free trade agreements with 73 countries is to do precisely that. But on border target operating model, I might just pass over to Lord Offord.
So with the new border target operating model, UK's got a unique opportunity to create the most dynamic border, which will speed things up and save businesses a lot of money. It's all to do with digital. So at the time we've passed the Electronic Trade Documents Act. So we just sent a bunch of valves from Burnley to Singapore with no paperwork. Right, that's a massive cost saving. We bring in the single trade window. How many times do you hear people complain about exporting overseas? You have to fill out 28 forms. How about just filling it out once, and it just cascades down through the system? The whole trusted trader scheme, the whole idea that you self-certify your goods and services, where they're going, where they're going to, they're pre-checked. to the point where I'm right in thinking that or hearing that the chief executive of the Channel Tunnel recently said that goods are flowing through the Channel Tunnel faster than when we were in the EU. So we've got an amazing opportunity in the border target operating model to make something really dynamic, really interesting, really fast. Along the way, there's also going to be some frictions, has to be, because we have to secure our borders, especially for SPS. We need to do that for our own biosecurity. But that's going to be done on a light touch basis, and it'll be done in a way which is very commensurate to making sure we don't put barriers up in front of trade. Overall, it'll be a great benefit to the UK.
So you believe that the Food and Drink Federation and Horticultural Trade Association are incorrect in the warnings that they've given about the changes this week? I spoke on just Friday of last week to a large horticultural importer in my constituency who said that they were staggered at how little information had been provided, said that they felt that everything was being left to the last minute, that there was no clarity from the department, and that they were concerned that what they're importing will end up rotting in sheds at Dover instead of being sold, as we hope, in Warrington.
Yep. So the whole objective of the exercise is to make sure that doesn't happen. At the end of the day, this is a cross-Whitehall initiative. Obviously, it's been run by Cabinet Office. DBT is heavily involved through myself. DEFRA, clearly, when it comes to the horticultural issues. And part of the issue here is trying to make sure this is light touch and works. It's possibly why there's been some delays in terms of communication, but that is the objective, to try and make this safe and secure but light touch and make sure it works. Ultimately, the benefit, we do need biosecurity. If you talk to all of our farmers and all the rural community, they will tell you that the cost of not having that, if you look at the cost of food and mouth, it's a lot more expensive.
So can you explain why the government failed to provide businesses with more than 3 weeks' notice for what they'll be expected to pay under the common user charge under these new arrangements?
I suspect that was because everyone was trying to get it down to be as low as possible.
In terms of businesses being able to plan, having that clarity and certainty for
Yes.
moving forward, do you think that 3 weeks or less is an appropriate amount of time for them to be able to plan for these changes?
No, I know there's been the frustration expressed on all sides of this equation, but the objective has been to try and minimise the cost and minimise the disruption.
It's all been very widely consulted on as well, Ms Nichols. In fact, as you know, the scheme was postponed and very, very widely consulted on right the way across the board. So I think there's been, if I might, I think we feel there's been no shortage of information, both in the UK and for our counterparts abroad.
And yet those concerns clearly still remain, because the Horticultural Trade Association are meeting all of their members today. So I don't take the Minister's assertion that, sort of everything's fine now and everyone's happy with the new arrangements, because clearly there is still that lack of clarity.
I don't see that. I think when you bring in anything new, of course, people are concerned and there is uncertainty. And this is a dynamic situation. When we come back a year from now, this will probably look different from the one that we implemented. That's the whole point of putting this thing in place. It will be a dynamic system which will make work for the benefit of everybody. But obviously at the point of impact, there is uncertainty, and I'm very sympathetic to that.
And before I go back to the Chair, I note the Minister's valiant campaigning to save the Chelsea bun. Unusually high rainfall this year could mean that farming groups are warning that we'll see a drastic reduction in domestic production levels this year, potentially putting more pressure on prices, including for the key ingredients for his beloved Chelsea bun. If this does happen and we start to see shortages of domestic product and an increase in the prices for imports, will the Minister push to suspend these rules?
Well, thank you, and thank you for mentioning my campaign. I was actually going to mention you could come, Ms Nichols, and visit with your interest in horticulture. We also have the Chelsea Flower Show coming up in just a few weeks' time, and you could perhaps combine the visit, pop into Partridge's and get your Chelsea bun. I would note, actually, you are right. The price of a Chelsea bun has gone up from £2.75 to £2.85 in recent weeks, but I think that is driven more by the publicity surrounding the Revival campaign, the articles that we've got in the Telegraph and in the Independent. Of course,
are you concerned that prices of the Chelsea bun going up further because of pressures on things like the citrus for the lemon zest that's in it, the currants, or heaven forbid the flour, might make the Chelsea ban unaffordable for your constituents.
Well, I can tell that...
Do you want to save it or not, Minister? Would you suspend these rules if Chelsea bans became unaffordable?
I can tell that you've been doing some baking or some knowledge of the ingredients quite precisely. And obviously the prices of commodities, particularly agricultural commodities, will fluctuate. Climate fluctuations has been something which has been part of the pricing of agricultural commodities. If you look back at the origins of commodity futures, like back in the 19th century, was very much based on the fluctuation of prices driven by things like weather, by climate, and other external factors. And I don't think that a fluctuation in price should make one necessarily want to do something like change the rules. I think you'd need to take a longer-term view on that.
But I think if ITV is correct, and it is a £3 billion impact of the new border operating model on UK consumers, then that surely must provoke the Department for Trade in having some serious conversations with colleagues at DEFRA.
We are talking to DEFRA, but I mean, for example, single trade window we think will give us a benefit of $3 billion, so we can trade the numbers. What our objective will be to, if that $3 billion is real, which I don't recognise the number, but we will work to get that number down.
So DEFRA has refused to publish the detailed workings or the methodology behind the cost estimates that it published in response to ITV last week. Yep. Could we ask you to provide the committee with your estimates in that case?
Well, I guess we'll be using DEFRA numbers, presumably, won't we? Because it's their department.
DEFRA numbers are pretty high level. There's no assumptions behind them, but we'll write you on that. Mr. Macdonald, very briefly.
Thank you very much. Just, Lord Offord, because you mentioned it around electronic documents and the electronic documents bill, which is all very exciting, have you got an estimate as to how much that will save businesses in terms of a cost around their bureaucracy? And the second point, and you rightly made out the importance of streamlining that trade, reducing the amount of documentation. Do you have an expectation for when this is going to be widely rolled out? I will use the seafood sector as an example within my constituency, which is still waiting for the electronification of their documents, which has been promised to them but never delivered. I recognise that is the case for many other sectors. So is there an expectation in your mind to see when we will have this universal across the country?
In that particular instance, around the seafood, obviously that's to do with the veterinary piece, and it's also the SPS piece is the most difficult piece of this because of the vet checks. But the objective of single trade window is to be ready to have that implemented by 2025, and we think that's going to...
Sorry, forgive me, across all sectors?
Yes. And
in 2025?
Well, 2025.
So at the start, middle or end?
Let's go for the middle.
Okay, thank you. Mark, pause.
Chair, can I move on from horticulture to automotive, which is a massive success story with 80% of its output exported, most of which, Minister, is built to an EU standard because the domestic market doesn't justify producing to a UK standard. But the industry is about to be affected both in the UK and elsewhere around the world by a massive number of vehicles coming in, inexpensive vehicles coming in from China, where there is a real concern that Chinese manufacturers have an unfair advantage in terms of the cost of their raw materials and particularly the energy inputs in their manufacture. The EU is looking at a trade remedy there, and given the possible danger to domestic manufacturers caused by the loss of markets in the EU and loss of sales in the UK, why wouldn't we join with our friends and colleagues in Europe to consider the possibility of a remedy against dumping of inexpensive Chinese manufactured electric vehicles?
Well, thank you, Mr. Palsy, and clearly we do speak to our like-minded trade counterparts on these kind of issues, whether it be the Commission, whether it be the United States Trade Representative and so on. Those are discussions which clearly we do have. We have a slightly different structure, in fact, a rather different structure to our trade remedies in the United Kingdom, that we have the Trade Remedies Authority that would start an investigation if a complaint or referral were made to the Trade Remedies Authority. And that, as far as I understand, is not something that has happened so far.
But the Secretary of State's got the power to initiate an investigation.
But we would ordinarily wait and see whether the Trade Remedies Authority will be conducting its own investigation, which would be based on a complaint from industry.
But it would only be in respect of the UK. What my question, Minister, is why don't we work with others with whom we've got strong relationships who are equally affected, because together we would be stronger, wouldn't we?
Well, we always, of course, Mr. Pawsey, have to follow World Trade Organization rules in these matters, and there are clear rules when it comes to trade damage and trade remedies. But we have the Independent Trade Remedies Authority, which is the starting point of that process.
We've got 4 or 5 EU anti-subsidy investigations that have been launched since late last year. There is real surprise in Europe that the UK has not joined in those anti-subsidy investigations. Are you telling us that we've got to wait for a complaint from industry to the Trade Remedy Authority before the Secretary of State will act on some really serious concerns about the unlevel playing field between the UK and China?
Well, I think if I might, Mr. Byrne, under WTO rules, you can't just sort of say somebody else has been damaged, therefore we must be being damaged as well. That is not a consistent or sustainable position at the WTO. The Commission, of course...
You don't think the UK car market is being damaged in the same way that it is in Europe?
That would be a matter of judgment for the Trade Remedies Authority following a proper investigation. But the Commission has got a very different way of examining trade remedies than the UK has.
But you're not prepared at this stage to initiate such an investigation using the powers that are available to you?
Well, that is a matter for the Secretary of State, but in the first term, we would expect the Trade Remedies Authority to look at that.
Okay. Charlotte Nichols.
No more from me, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Pawsey.
My points have been raised there, Chair, as well.
Perfect. Anthony.
Hello, me again. Lord Offord, can I just sort of draw your attention to the Department's ability to work across the country and how it engages with chambers of commerce? Perhaps you could give us a bit of insight as to how your department does so and whether or not it does and whether or not it's successful.
Yes, we're very active with chambers of commerce, but we're active with all the stakeholder groups, whether it's a Small Business Federation, whether it's CBI, wherever it might be, we talk to them all. The chambers is a key interlocutor for us. For example, I'm doing a lot of roadshows at the moment around the UK regions and towns. It's called Made in the UK, Sold to the World. We then change it where we're going to Made in Bristol, Sold to Bahrain, wherever you want it to be. And we've got representative chambers at all of these events. All our export champions that we have in our regions are all linked into the chambers. That's all done on a voluntary basis. It's not done on the mandatory basis like the German model, where they are mandated to sign up to their local chamber. This is a voluntary process, but we work very closely with them. The toolkit we have for helping companies export is now, I think, best in class. We've now got, between the Export Academy, Export Support Service, International Trade Advisors, links to the 180 embassies and commissions around the world, the DBT teams around the regions, linking to the FTAs. We've got a really, really strong ecosystem. The only bit that's missing is the communication of this. We just have to communicate this better, and the chambers have got a key role to help us with that.
Can I just ask, do you think we should mandate like Germany? And can I also ask whether or not you feel the UK is learning from international examples? In this case, Germany or others that are doing a good job.
I'm not particularly in favour of mandating. I think this country is a free trade country. 60% of our trade is free trade. It's just the way it's our ecosystem. So the German model is a different model, but we work very well with the UK chambers.
Last week I hosted a trade roadshow for Santander, who have got a trade barometer. So I'm also declaring my interest on that one, but that's as far as my interests go. Perhaps you could also give a bit of understanding or an explanation between how your department is working with the private sector in the case of someone like Santander and whether or not that's working, because the big criticism I have from my respective chambers of commerce is that they hear about these trade deals, but they're not very easily signposted. They don't really understand how they can take advantage of, and unless they are sort of middle to big companies, they're not really getting the benefits of these trade deals. I hope that's not the case, but perhaps you could answer.
Well, that's why we're putting all our effort into going direct to local communities, and the bank's got a key role to play. They're key intermediaries. Last week I was at a big forum with ICC, International Chamber of Commerce. Santander was represented there along with all high street banks. And what we're trying to do is say to them, it's easy, these deals are now, you can get to Australia easily. You know, we've cut the tariffs down. you can make margin in Australia, and with electronic trade documents you can get your goods there within 48 hours. And so it's a communication job to say to people the world is tilting. I mean, we all know the stats that when we joined the what was then the common market, Europe accounted for 1/3 of global trade. And we know when we left it was 16% of global trade. We know in 2050 it's going to be 9% of global trade. So businesses out there in Burnley, in Swansea, in Glasgow, in Falkirk, they know that, and they now need to know how to get to Vietnam, how to get to Mexico, how to get Peru, and it's our job to get them there.
I mean, I hope you'll come back in front of this committee to update us as time goes by and to show how the website is improving, because if you are to go on it now, again, you can be directed to multiple different pages. It is complex, it is difficult. Your point of communication lands well, and I think is one that is needs to be addressed in pretty quick order.
Great.gov.uk.
Thank you very much.
I'm conscious that you want to go to Foreign Office questions at 11:30, so perhaps I could just wrap up, Minister, with a question about trade strategy. So a lot of the evidence that we've received points to the need for an overarching trade strategy. We've heard that from a number of our witnesses. And when I sat down with my local Chamber of Commerce in Birmingham last week, they also expressed the view that an overarching trade strategy would be a real benefit, something that just set out the kind of messages that we were keen to tell the world, something that helped us orchestrate and choreograph our soft power, and crucially something that just helped us get the basics right, whether that was maximising export support services or just promoting the benefits of investing in the UK. Why don't we have an overarching trade strategy that perhaps enshrines some of the targets and goals that Lord Offord has set out?
Well, we do have an overarching trade strategy. We just don't have a DBT trade strategy document. And I think you can actually drive a lot without necessarily having a huge document in front of you. We do have documents in related areas, like, for example, Lord Offord's export strategy, like, for example, the integrated review, like, for example, the negotiation objectives before each individual free trade agreement. But since being involved in this in 2016, I haven't felt the need for there to be a sort of blockbuster trade strategy document that might actually be of more benefit for our trade negotiation partners, those on the other side of the table, who might be able to see what it is, the principal UK objectives, before we even start that trade negotiation.
Strategy documents don't need to be blockbusters, and they don't need to be very long, but there could be benefit in helping, for example, chambers of commerce like my Chamber of Commerce in Birmingham understand what the government's trade strategy looks like.
Well, I would, and we talked earlier, Chair, about allocating resources within the department. I would rather have my officials, if you like, being on the front line, breaking down those barriers, promoting exports, negotiating free trade agreements, than being in the world of producing a document. I would refer them, I think, the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, which is an excellent Chamber of Commerce. In fact, the very first Chamber of Commerce I visited when I first became involved in trade in the summer of 2016, I would refer them principally to Lord Offord's export strategy.
Okay. Well, that's been an extremely helpful session in helping us take the evidence that we need in order to produce the committee's advice to the department over the months to come. But I think that now concludes our questions, and so with our committee's thanks to you for appearing, order.
The proceeding has ended.